Hilchos Megillah v'Chanukah, Perek Sheni, the laws of the Megillah and Chanukah. Chapter 2, today is all about the specifics of Megillah reading. Yesterday we learned about the general obligation and the times when to read Megillah. Now let's talk about actual reading of the Megillah, the laws that go into it. So the Rambam begins with the following halach. Says the Rambam, HaKoireyas HaMegillah L'Mafreya, somebody who reads the Megillah backwards, Lo Yatza. He hasn't fulfilled his obligation. So if he reads verse number 4, then verse number 3, then verse number 2, doesn't fulfill his obligation. Even if he ends up reading the whole Megillah, but because he read it backwards, doesn't work.
Could it be words backwards?
No, the Talmud says it's only verses backwards, not words out of order. That's for sure. Not fulfill his obligation. Kara v'shachach pasuk echad. What if you read the Megillah in order, and you forgot one verse in the middle? The kara pasuk sheni lai. You read the verse after it. The chazar v'kara pasuk sheshachach. Then you went back and you read the verse that you forgot. The chazar v'kara pasuk shlishi. And then you went and skipped back to verse number 3. So you started a verse, you skipped one, went back, and then skipped that one too. You haven't fulfilled the obligation because you just read one verse backwards. Rather, what must you do? If you skip a verse, what should you do? You go back to the verse that you forgot and you read in order. The Baal Shem Tov famously said, the mafreya, besides for backwards, also means in the past. Somebody who reads the Megillah and he thinks that it only happened in the past, and it's not a reoccurring miracle, lo yatsa. Because to really live Purim, you have to see that it's happening even today. Base. Matzat tzibur shekaru chetzia. You come to shul, it's Purim night, and you came late. The community already finished half of the Megillah. Lo yoimar, don't say to yourself, ekra chetzia ha'achar enim hatzibur. Let me listen to the second half with the community. I'm going to go later and reread the first half. That's reading backwards. You're going to read the second half before the first half. You have to read. You came late. You missed it. Read it on your own, from the beginning to the end, in order. What if you read it in order, but there was delays in between? So you read chapter 1, then you went for a break, you fell asleep. You didn't talk, but there was a delay. And then you kept on reading. Even though you paused with enough time to finish the whole thing, say it takes 45 minutes to read the Megillah, right? So you read chapter 1, and then you wait 40 minutes. In 40 minutes, you could have finished the rest of the chapters. Even though you waited that long, since you read in order, you're okay. Doesn't matter how long it took you, that's the point. Gimel HaKoireyas HaMegillah Al Peh. What if you read the Megillah by heart? You're so expert, you know the Megillah by heart. You just rattle it off without looking inside. Lo yatsa yedei chayvasa. You haven't fulfilled your obligation, you have to read it from the writing. But what about foreign languages? Haloyes, a foreigner, sheshamas HaMegillah haksuva b'lashon HaKodesh ubiksav HaKodesh. If he hears the Megillah that's written in holy tongue and in holy script, even if you don't know what they're saying, you fulfill your obligation. You come to shul, you're an American guy, a French guy, you have no idea what Hebrew means, but the guy is reading from a Hebrew Megillah in Hebrew, good. Fascinating. Even if the Megillah was written in ancient Greek, and you listen to it that way, you fulfilled your obligation even though you don't recognize the language. Even if the person who's listening is a person that speaks Hebrew, so he should ideally listen to it in the ideal language. But Yivanit, for many things in the ancient times, the sages compared ancient Greek to regular Hebrew. And you can fulfill your obligation with ancient Greek. Today, it doesn't work, but it used to apply in that way. So that's all for a Megillah written in Hebrew or written in Greek. Hoysa ksuva targum. What if it was written in another translation, another language? Targum is Aramaic. Or another language of the non-Jewish languages. Nobody can fulfill their obligation through reading it unless you know the language. If you know the language, dry halacha, you would fulfill your obligation. And the commentaries say either of these two options are good. See, on the left, you have, let's say, English Megillah in English letters. And it was in the days of Achashverosh, etc. But you could also write in the English language in Hebrew letters. Look on the right, I wrote, and it was in the days of Achashverosh. But it's English, but it's in Hebrew letters. Transliterated is okay. The Kesef Mishnah writes.
Even today?
Yeah, well, today we just use a regular Megillah, but technically, yeah. There's the Kesef Mishnah writes that transliteration is okay. And Rav Kapach, who was one of the famous translators of the Rambam's works, he says that he had in his possession a Megillah written in Arabic and Hebrew letters. It was actually used. V'hu, says the Rambam, huh?
That wouldn't look as weird as that.
Yeah, exactly. V'hu, says the Rambam, that's provided, Shatiya ksuva biksav oisei halashin. It has to be written in that language. In either way, English letters or Hebrew words, English letters. But it has to be written using the English language. But if I translate it while I'm reading, avalim hoya ksuva biksav ivri, ukra aramis la arami, if I have a Hebrew Megillah, proper Megillah, but I'm sight translating. As I don't read it in Hebrew. I read it in Aramaic, but while I look at the Hebrew. Understand?
Yeah.
I'm reading from a Hebrew text, but I'm saying other language words. Lo yatsa. That's not fulfilling your obligation. Because in essence, I'm reading it by heart. Because I'm looking at the Hebrew, but the words that I'm saying are in a different language, and they're not written in the Megillah. So since the reader didn't fulfill his obligation, the one who hears from him also cannot fulfill his obligation. Oh, I wanted to show you this also. This is English, but this is English transliterated. Verstehst? This is another option. No, this one doesn't work.
Is this kosher?
This is not kosher. This is not kosher. Hebrew letters, English words, or English letters, English words. But Hebrew words and English letters doesn't work. Okay, again. Hey, Megillah kavana. If somebody reads the Megillah without intent, lo yatsa, he hasn't fulfilled his obligation. Ketzad. What would that look like? How would a person read the Megillah without intent? Haya kaisva. If he was writing the Torah scroll, the Megillah. So as he's writing on the night of Purim, he says the Megillah as he's writing. Oidarsha, or maybe he's giving a class on the Megillah, and he's reading from a real Megillah. He says, Vayhi b'mei Achashverosh, hu Achashverosh. Let me explain this verse. But he reads every word, but he isn't intending to fulfill the mitzvah. Or maybe he's a scribe, and he's checking a Megillah. Not writing it, but he's checking it, and as he goes, he reads the whole Megillah. If he directly intends to fulfill his obligation through this reading, yatsa, fulfill his obligation.
You mean he intends and he make an explanation?
Yeah, but while he's reading it, he has in mind that I want to fulfill my obligation through this reading.
He fulfills.
Yeah.
Even he makes inserts.
Even if he inserts explanations. But if he doesn't intend, lo yatsa, then of course, he doesn't fulfill his obligation. If you read the Megillah while you're dozing off, since you didn't fully fall asleep, just dozing off, yatsa, you fulfill your obligation. When do we say that when you have in mind while writing, you fulfill your obligation? When he wants to have in mind to fulfill his obligation through reading in the book that he's copying from. See, whenever you read a Megillah or a Torah scroll, you always have a book that you're copying from, and you read from there and you copy into your Megillah. So the writer has to have in mind to fulfill his obligation from the Megillah which he's copying from. But if you didn't have in mind to fulfill your obligation with the reading that you're copying from, with this reading that you're doing while you're writing, you don't fulfill your obligation. That's one way to read it. Others say, if you're only having in mind to fulfill your obligation with the writing that you're doing right now, you have to fulfill your obligation. Because you can only fulfill your obligation by reading it from a Megillah where the whole thing is written. Since while you're writing the scroll, you're just writing it for the first time, the scroll isn't complete, so you can't fulfill your obligation. Somebody's reading the Megillah, he makes a mistake while reading it. And he reads a reading with mistakes. Yatsa, you fulfilled your obligation. Because we're not so careful with the Megillah. It doesn't have the name of Hashem. It isn't so high level. You made a couple of grammar mistakes, not a problem. If you read it sitting or standing, you're okay. Even in a community where typically we say you should stand for the honor of the community, here it's okay if you sat. Initially, you shouldn't read it sitting in the community. That's not honor to the community. But if you did it after the fact, it's okay. If two people read the Megillah together, or even 10 at once, all the readers fulfill the obligation, and the listeners fulfill the obligation. Typically, we say you can't hear two sounds at once. Remember the laws of shofar? If two guys blow shofar at once, you can't listen to both of them. But here by Megillah, we say you could.
The blessing should be in standing or in
Standing.
sitting?
Also, an adult can read the Megillah together with a child, even in the community, even if it's in public. As long as there's an adult reading, a kid could help along. In public, you cannot read from a Megillah that's written amongst other writings. Today we have a Megillah scroll by itself, but they used to have, like, this is the famous, one of the famous codexes, Keter Aram Tzova it's called. They found the whole Tanakh in one book. So if you have the book of Esther, in this book, amongst other writings, you cannot read from that book in public. It has to be from a separate Megillah, a scroll that's independent.
I myself can.
Yes, in public we don't.
Because that's what
Yeah, of course. If you read it that way, you haven't fulfilled the obligation. Unless it was taller or shorter than the rest of the book. If all the pages were equal, no good. If the pages of the Megillah of Esther were higher or lower, then you're good. So there's a clear demarcation, a clear recognition for it. An individual can read it even if it's not higher or shorter. No problem. You fulfill your obligation. You can only write a Megillah with ink on parchment. Gvil is the unprocessed parchment. Klaf is when you divide it in half and the inner side is the klaf. Like a Torah scroll, that's the only thing you can write a Megillah on. If you wrote the Megillah not with proper ink, but with gallnut juice or with this type of vitriol, a dark black ink, it's kosher. Even though it's not going to be erased typically, and typically we have to have a writing that could be erased, here it's okay. If you wrote the Megillah with other kinds of dye, other colors, disqualified. It has to have lines, ruled lines, like a Torah scroll. But the parchment on which you write doesn't have to be worked, tanned, with the intent to be used for the mitzvah. But if it was written on paper or on leather that wasn't fully processed, not fully processed parchment, or a non-Jew, idol-worshipping Gentile, or apostate Jew wrote the Megillah, psula, it's disqualified. It has to be written by a proper Jew. If there was letters in the Megillah that were faded or torn, if the mark is still recognizable, even if the fade is on most of the letter, it's still kosher. We're very lenient when it comes to Megillah. Because there's no God's name in it, so most things that you wouldn't get away with in a Torah scroll, you can get away with in a Megillah. But if you can't even tell, in the place of the fade, it's so erased or it's so cracked that nothing is left over there, if most of the rest of the letter is complete, it's kosher. But if not, then it's taka disqualified. And if you read it, you haven't fulfilled the obligation. It's fascinating. Even if the scribe left out some letters or left out some verses, and the reader who happens to know the Megillah by heart, he inserts those verses or those letters that he missed, Yatza, it's okay. Because you didn't read the whole Megillah by heart. Most of it is in front of you. Yud Aleph, HaMegillah tzricha shetehei tfura kula. The Megillah has to be sewn down with stitches. Ad sheyu kol ereiseha Megillah achas, till all the parchments that you use to write the Megillah on become one long scroll. Ve'eina nitferes ela begidin kesefer Torah. You only use to sew it the animal veins, like I showed you when we were in the laws of tefillin, like a Torah scroll. V'im tafra shalei begidin psula. If you sew it up with things that are not animal sinews, it's disqualified. It's got to be the regular way, like a Torah scroll. You don't have to sew up the entire length of the parchments, like a Torah scroll. Ela afilu tafar begidin shalish tviris b'ktei hayiriyah, b'shalish be'emtza, b'shalish b'katza hasheni. Even if you only do 9 stitches, 3 on the bottom, 3 in the middle, 3 on the top, ksheira, it's kosher. Mipnei shenikras igeres, because it's still called a letter. The Megillah calls the Megillah a letter, igeret hapurim. And so once you sew up in the middle, bottom, and top, it's already called a letter, and that's okay. Yud Beis, v'tzarech hakoirei, when the reader reads the Megillah, he must likreis aseres b'nei Haman va'aseres b'neshima achas. You have to read all the 10 sons of Haman and the word aseret in one breath. So here there's a Megillah. In many Megillahs, they're all in one column. So here it talks about how the Jews destroyed the people of Shushan. In the bottom of here it says, Chamesh me'ot ish, 500 people, plus the 10 sons of Haman. Ve'et Parshandata, ve'et Dalphon, all 10 sons. Then it says in the bottom, Aseret b'nei Haman. So the reader has to read this whole column in one breath. Why? Because in the times of the Purim story, all 10 sons of Haman were hung at once. They all died together. So we read them all together. As the Rambam says, to let everybody know, shekulam nislu v'nergu ke'echad, that they were all hung and killed together.
Is that difficult?
Huh?
Practically speaking, is it like difficult?
No. Once you learn how to do it, it's not so hard. Umin hakol Yisrael, it's the custom of all Jews. Shehakoirei ha-Megillah koirei upoishet ki igeres. That whoever reads the Megillah opens it up. You don't read the Megillah like a little scroll and move from column to column. You open up the whole thing, you fold it like a letter. Laharos hanes, to display the miracle. Ukeshayigmar, when you finish, chayzer v'karcha kula umevarich. According to the Rambam, you first roll it up and then you make the after blessing. Other opinions say you should make the after blessing and then roll it up. So the Minhag Chabad is to do both. We start rolling it up, and then we make the blessing while we finish rolling it up. Yud Gimel, Shnei Hayamim Ha'ilu, Shein Arba Asar v'Chamisha Asar, these 2 days of Purim, 14th and 15th of Adar, Asurin Behesped V'Tainis L'chol Adam B'chol Makom. Nobody can make a eulogy or a fast on these days. It's forbidden. Bein Libnei Krakin, Shein Eisin Chamisha Asar Bilvad, Bein Libnei Ayarais, Shein Eisin Arba Asar Bilvad. Whether if you're in a walled city where you're only celebrating the 15th of Adar, still on the 14th you can't fast or do a eulogy. And whether you're in an unwalled city, you're celebrating Purim on the 14th of Adar, you cannot make a eulogy or a fast the next day. In a leap year, both months are forbidden. What we call Purim Katan, Shushan Purim Katan, the 14th, 15th of the first Adar, and the second are both forbidden to make fasts and eulogies. People in the villages who go back to the Monday or Thursday before, as we saw yesterday, and read the Megillah then, mutarim behesped v'tainis b'yem kriyasa, on that day they're allowed to do a eulogy or a fast, because only reading the Megillah, it's not considered Purim. V'asurin behesped v'tainis b'shnei yamim ha'ilu v'afal pi she'ein karin b'hen. But the 14th, 15th of Adar, they cannot do fasts or eulogies, even if they are not reading the Megillah on that day. They already read it before. Doesn't matter. These 2 days are the holiday. So that concludes the halachot relevant to Megillah reading. Yudalid mitzvas yem arba asar livnei kfarim ba'ayaris. V'yem chamisha asar livnei krakim. If you're in an unwalled city or you're in a village on the 14th, or if you're in a walled city on the 15th, it's a mitzvah liyason yem simcha umishtet, to make them into a day of rejoicing and feasting. Umishleach manis l'reim, umatanis le'avyonim, sending gifts to your friends and gifts to the poor. These are the 4 mitzvahs of Purim: matanot le'avyonim, tzedakah, Megillah reading, mishleach manot, and a feast. Umutar ba'asiyas malacha, it's permitted to do work on Purim. V'afal pikein ein roi lasas bei malacha. Nevertheless, it's not proper to do work. You should avoid work if possible. Amru chachamim, the sages said, kol ha'oisem malacha b'yom Purim ein raya simin bracha la'ilam. Anybody who does work on Purim will not see a blessing from the money. They're going to go to something else that he wouldn't want to pay for. B'nei kfarim shekadmu v'karu b'sheni b'chamishi. People in the villages who went back and read on Monday or Thursday before Purim. Im chilku ma'is la'avyonim b'yom kriyasan yatsu. If they gave money to the poor on that day when they read the Megillah, even though it isn't Purim, they fulfilled their obligation. Aval hasimcha b'hamishta, but the rejoicing and the feasting, ein oisin oisam ela b'yom arba asar, you can only do them on day the 14th. B'mikdimu la'yatsu, if you make them early, you don't fulfill your obligation. Usu'udas Purim sha'asa b'layla la'yatsu yedei chayvasei, as well the meal of Purim. If you do it by night of Purim, it doesn't work. You got to do it by day. Tesvav, Ketzad Chayvas Su'udazu. What does the meal of Purim look like? Shayechal Basar. First of all, you got to eat meat. V'yisakein Su'udana Kefi Asher Timtza Yadai. Make a good meal, as your hand can afford. Drink wine till you get so drunk that you fall asleep in your drunkenness. It's called Ad Lo Yada. V'chein chayav adam l'shloyach shtei manes basar shnei minei tavshil shnei minei oichlin achabeirei. A person is also obligated to send 2 types of meat, or 2 types of cooked foods, or 2 types of general foods, just 2 foods to your friend. Shanamar, as it says, "Umishleach manos ish l'rei'ehu." We send gifts, 1 man to his friend. Shtei manos leish echad. 2 foods to 1 person. That's the obligation.
That's the only obligation? Not
It's the only obligation.
3 people?
No, 3 is a custom.
Okay.
The obligation is to 1 person. The more you send to friends, the better you are, sure. But it's only 1, is the chiyuv. If you don't have any extra food to give, switch your meal with your friend. Find another poor guy, switch your meal. So you give him food, he gives you food. Each one sends his meal to his friend. The Talmud says that that's 2 rabbis would do that every year because they were very poor. They just switched their meals. To fulfill the obligation of sending gifts of food to your friend. Additionally, you must give money to the poor on Purim. And here, it's got to be 2 poor people. No less than 2 poor people. You give each person either a gift, or mois, or money, or tavshil, or a cooked dish, or or food. Shanamar, as it says, you have to give gifts to the poor. Shtei matanos l'shnei aniyim, both in the plural. 2 gifts to 2 poor people. We shouldn't be exact when it comes to Purim money. We should be very generous. Whoever puts out his hand to take money, you give. You never change money that was put away for Purim to another money. If it was put away for Purim, you keep it for Purim. Yud Zayin. Which of the 2 should you do more? Matanot le'avyanim or mishloach manot? What's better? Give more gifts of food to a friend or to the poor? Poor. Mutav la'adam, says the Rambam, it's better for a person laharbais b'matnes of yainim, milaharbais b'suudasai or b'shleach manis l'reyav. It's better for a person to increase the money that he gives to the poor than increasing his own Purim meal or the food that he sends to his friends. She'ein sham simcha gedelo mufuara. There is no greater, there is no beautiful happiness ela l'sameach levanim v'yasayimim v'almanis v'gerim, except for somebody who makes the heart of poor people, orphans, widows, converts, who makes their heart rejoice. If you make these hearts of these unfortunate people rejoice, you are like the Shekhinah, like Hashem, like the divine presence. Shenemar, as it says, what is God's trademark? To revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive those with crushed and broken hearts. And the Rambam tells us how great Purim is. Kol Sifrei HaNeviim, the Chol HaKsuvim, all the books of the prophets, all the books of the writings, Asidin Libatel Limaisa Mashiach, are going to be cancelled when Mashiach comes. We're not going to use them anymore. Chutz mi Megillas Esther, except for the Megillah of Esther. V'harei kayemes, it's going to last forever. Kachamisha chum she'Torah, v'kahalacha shel Torah she'ba'al peh. Like the 5 books of Moses, and like all the halachot of the oral Torah, she'einon b'teilin le'olam, which are never going to be cancelled ever. What does it mean it's going to be cancelled? It means that there's not going to be any novelty in it. The whole idea of the prophets and the Ketuvim is to help us understand the Tzivuyei Torah, or to warn us about keeping the Torah laws. But in Mashiach's times, everyone's going to do it. No one's going to need extra warnings. So all the other prophets are going to be relegated to non-necessary. The Megillat Esther, because of the great miracle that happened, is going to stay forever.
But he used the word betelin.
Huh?
Betelin means
Yeah,
you will
but the
never
Rebbe says, no, the Rebbe says betelim means they're going to be nullified in importance.
Okay.
It's not going to have chashivut.
That's the problem with
Yeah, of
proper
course.
Hebrew and what about ancient Hebrew?
Huh? Shabbos, it says also going to be canceled because not that we're going to stop keeping Shabbos, but the meaning, like, it's not going to be so much greater. Today, Shabbos is more than the week is greater, but it's all holy when Mashiach comes. So the holiness of Shabbos is going to melt in the face of holiness of Mashiach. Even though, of course, any memory of pain is going to be cancelled. Shenemar, as it says, all the earlier troubles have been forgotten and been hidden from my eyes. The days of Purim are never going to be cancelled. Which means that even though we're going to keep reading about in the Megillah the problems that the Jews went through, but we're only going to feel how it was a medium, a means to an end, to becoming something good. And the holidays of Purim will never be cancelled. Shenemar, as it says, V'mei ha-Purim ha'ele la yavru mitei ha-Yehudim. These days of Purim will never go away from the Jews. V'zichram la yosuf mizardam, nor will their remembrance ever stop from their offspring. We're always going to celebrate Purim, even when Mashiach comes.